Welcome to Emmanuel Anglican Church in Glenhaven. We believe that the Bible, being God's Word, is true and good, and so we hope that this Bible reading and reflection in the form of a sermon is a great encouragement to you in your faith. And whether you're a Christian or merely curious about the Christian faith, if you'd like to join us in person, you'd be very welcome to do so any Sunday. You can find out more at www.glenhaven.church.
The reading is taken from Romans chapter 1, verses 16 through to 32. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people, who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
We're continuing looking at our series in the book of Romans, St. Paul's letter to the church in Rome, written some 20 years after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension to the Father's right hand. And at the end of last week's reading, and at the beginning of today's reading, we read the following. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile, that is the non-Jew. Salvation is offered to whom? It's offered to anyone and everyone who believes. But what does a person need saving? What do we need rescuing from? More on that in a moment. It will not have escaped your attention that it is a challenging passage. And Simon Sinek, leadership guru and best-selling author, he observes that for any organisation, in fact, for any community, to be healthy, it is important to have difficult conversations, to have those uncomfortable engagements. It won't surprise you that people often ask him, and quite often, how do you start a conversation like that? And he says the best way to start a difficult conversation is by saying, I think we need to have a difficult conversation. And so it'll probably not surprise you, as we are looking at Romans 1:18 and following, for me to say to you, I think we're about to have a difficult conversation. Let me change gear for a moment. I was reading an article recently about the role of conductors in relation to music. What does a conductor do? And they asked a fellow by the name of Nicholas Collin, chief conductor at Aurora Orchestra, a British chamber orchestra based in London, and they asked him what exactly a conductor does. This was his reply. A lot. Most obviously, the conductor, find my place, can set the tempo the orchestra plays at. But there are many other layers which a good conductor can influence in both rehearsal and performance, shaping the sound, balancing the different instrumental sections, pacing the breadth of the piece. In short, enabling the orchestra to play well together. They asked a follow-up question about whether, can musicians manage without a conductor? This was his response. Conductors are skilled at what they do, but so too are the musicians of the orchestras. So what would happen if the conductor wasn't there? Well, that very much depends on the complexity of the music and how well the orchestra can play together as a unit. In complex contemporary scores, it could fall apart very quickly without a conductor. Well, in my view, as a society, in many ways, we have in modern times, whether in the rejection of Christian ethics and the dilution of the Ten Commandments, or the normalization of nominalism and no religious affiliation, we have, as it were, fired the conductor. And in many ways, ethically and socially, we have been able to muddle our way forward for some time. But life is not simple. It is a complex score with many moving pieces. And it's my view, but not my view alone, that our society is becoming increasingly discordant and cacophonous. This is what Romans 1 and 2 speak to. What happens when you fire the conductor? When a person or a people reject God's sovereign rule? Verse 16 says that salvation is offered to everyone who believes. But what does a person need saving from? What do we need rescuing from? The answer there is in verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. In short, we need saving from God's wrath, or wrath as our American friends pronounce it. What is wrath? In short, it is anger. But it is not a capricious, unpredictable, had a bad day at work, kick the cat, temper tantrum kind of anger. It's not like that at all. It is personal because God is personal and it concerns persons whom he cares about deeply, namely us. So it's certainly personal, but it's not unpredictable. It is God's permanent, settled, determined opposition to evil. Remember last week, we wanted to leave room for the theological nuance of the meaning of the word righteousness and the different ways in which it's used in the book of Romans. But I observed that righteousness and goodness are pretty much synonyms. And so it ought not to surprise us, therefore, that God's goodness is inherently opposed to ungoodness. God's wrath is being revealed against, verse 18, all the godlessness and wickedness of people. Let me name a problem. I'll pick up at verse 19. I'll read from the New International Reader's Version here. The truth about God is plain to them. God has made it plain to them. Ever since the world was created, it has been possible to see the qualities of God that are not seen. I'm talking about his eternal power and about the fact that he is God. Those things can be seen where? In what he has made. so people have no excuse for what they do. In recent times, there has been within the universities and the academy a move to separate art from authorial intent, to shift the locus of interpretive authority from the creator to the commentators who are observing. In short, what they're saying is this: once the artwork is finished, it has nothing to do with the artist. They're entirely separate. I'm not so sure about that. Take, for instance, many of you would be familiar with Van Gogh's famous painting. I wasn't sure how to pronounce that, so I asked Johannes Kuhnen, a Dutch man in our morning service. He assures me it is Van Gogh. Van Gogh's famous painting, The Starry Night, reflecting the view from the room in which he was confined owing to his erratic mental health. He wrote about this work to his sister, Wilhelmine. The night, Van Gogh writes, is even more richly coloured than the day, coloured in the most intense violets, blues and greens. Some stars are lemony, others have a pink, green, forget-me-not blue glow. Indeed, writing to his brother Theo, he says, I have a terrible need of, shall I say the word, religion, and so I go out at night to paint the stars. The point is that there is, of course, a profound and deeply personal connection between the artwork and the artist. And as with the canvas, so with all of creation. As the early church father Tertullian wrote, nature is our teacher and our soul is the student. Verse 19. The truth about God is plain to them. God has made it plain to them. It is clear. Is unambiguous, because the very existence of creation, the character of creation, points towards a creator. Look, you can't tell everything about God from creation, but we can tell enough. Enough to know that if there is a creator, and there is, and I'm part of this creation, and I am, then there is a sense in which we belong to God. And therefore no person can say, but I didn't know. Verse 20 says that because creation speaks to us clearly, then we are clearly responsible for how we respond to God. Verse 20, people have no excuse for what they do. But some people still don't seem to get it, do they? The testimony of Romans 1 is there for us in verse 18, and this explains why they suppress the truth. Why would someone suppress or actively silence the truth? The answer is because they don't like that truth. In the children's book written by Trenton Lee Stewart and adapted for Netflix, The Mysterious Benedict Society, there's a bunch of children and an endearingly eccentric Mr. Benedict, and they attempt to save the world from a villain who has the ability to manipulate people's moods. And so upon discovering the evil plot, the main character, Rennie, suggests that they go and tell the town. We must tell the people what's going on, to which Mr. Benedict, with wisdom and kindness, observes, Oh, Rennie, I know you've got the evidence, but proof is useless unless it's proof of something that people already want to believe. St. Paul contends that our accountability to God is to many viewed as an inconvenient truth. That's the reason why it is so often shushed or discredited. Not because it's opaque, but because it's offensive. Not because it's unclear, but because it is unwelcome. In the words of verse 32, although they know God's righteous decree, they continue to do the very things and approve of those who practice them. They know, but they don't want to know. And so, verse 18, God's wrath is revealed. But how is it revealed? In Romans 2, it speaks of the coming day of judgment. But in Romans 1, God's wrath is revealed in a very interesting way. You'll see there, verse 24, verse 26, verse 28. God gave them over. God gave them over. God gave them over. To what? We'll read verse 24 in its entirety. God gave them over in or to the sinful desires of their hearts. This giving over language captures both the sense of our disordered human desires, namely that we love that which we ought not to love, and that which we do love, which is good, we love those things in the wrong measure or in the wrong priority. But it also captures God's respect for human beings, allowing them to make their own choices and to take responsibility for their own choices. This giving over language captures both the human propensity to harden our own hearts, as well as God hardening of the human heart according to his sovereign and good will. Or to draw on the imagery of the prodigal son, many of you would know that wonderful story from Luke 15, in which the rebellious son, without respect for his father or regard for the consequences of his own choices, asks, demands for his share of the inheritance now, before the father dies. In that culture, such behaviour would have been sufficient for the father to bring charges against his son of being persistently rebellious and profligate. You can read about that in Deuteronomy 21. But he does not do so. I'm sure with deep sadness, the father allows the son to make his choices. He gives him over to his own foolish and sinful desires. This is the judgment of God spoken of in verse 18. In short, God gives us what we ask for. And Paul highlights two particular ways in which that manifests in that particular context to which he is writing. Firstly, verse 22 and 23, as well as verse 25. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. It is rare in our culture to have images or icons or statues that look like creatures, although Mrs. Maxwell has drawn our attention to a gecko that does make its rounds in Glenhaven. But in certain cultures and countries, that practice is very common, isn't it? You may have been to such places and seen such things. Sacrifices or prayers are offered to a stone god. And in the Gentile society at the time of Paul's writing, this was very common. There were temples everywhere. Today, in modern and Western cultural contexts, this is much rarer, but whilst the outward practice is rare today, the inward posture is alive and well. What is the principle that underlies idolatry? It's there for us in verse 25. It continues to be on screen. It is worshipping and serving created things rather than the Creator. This is not rocket science. This is not complicated. It is the clear teaching of the Bible and the testimony of our conscience that God is to be first in our heart, our highest priority. And whilst there are many good things in creation, and there are, such things are not to usurp God's rightful place as our sovereign, as the king. Or to put that differently, God has no interest in silver medals. None at all. And so when we welcome the good things in the world, we must be careful. So whether it's financial security, family well-being, physical or mental health, travel and experience, a settled sense of home, beauty, and adulation, professional achievements, study or any other thing, we are not to worship other things. But someone here might object, Hayden, lovely to be here, respect you as a Christian minister, but I'm just not religious. I'm more of a secular person, so I don't really worship anything. Well, you might be willing to listen to a secular prophet of sorts. This quote from David Foster Wallace, best-selling author and one of America's finest writers of essays, and by no means a believer, addresses this question of worship. He writes, because here is something else that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. But the insidious things about these other forms of worship is not that, in his view, they're evil or sinful. He is concerned that they are unconscious. They are default settings for the kind of worship you just gradually slip into, day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. According to David Foster Wallace, worship is not optional for any person. It is intrinsic to the human heart. But we're not conscious of it. And if we're not conscious of it, we will not choose wisely. And something can easily become everything. And then all the other things in our life only derive value to the extent that they help us to achieve our new goal or to worship our new God. He goes on to explain the following. He says, if you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. You'll never feel enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel, you guessed it, ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. Worship power, you will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you'll need ever more power over others to numb your fear. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. Pretty much anything else you worship, he says, will eat you alive. Imagine a world that prizes power and influence above all else. What a bloody and brutal and lonely world that would be. Imagine a world where beauty matters more than anything else. What a vain and shallow and insincere world that would be. Imagine a world that values intellect and rationality above all else. What a proud and foolish and insecure world that would be. Idols dishonour God, full stop. Idols also are deeply destructive to human flourishing. Yet this is what God in his wrath has given us over to. And that brings us to our second point. What is the finest contribution that ancient Greece has made to modern society? Perhaps democracy or philosophy. It is without, in my estimation, the kebab. Now, I know there is some debate about whether kebabs are originally Turkish or Greek, but Plato, Greek Plato, father of political philosophy Plato, student of Socrates and teacher of Aristotle Plato, said in his work The Republic, roughly in 375 BC, that, and I quote, heroes do not stew their meat, they cook it on a spit over an open fire. Sure sounds like a kebab to me. I'll come back to Plato in just a moment. It is into this Greco-Roman culture that Paul speaks. He addresses idolatry, but also draws our attention to the practice of homosexuality in verses 26 and 27. I'll read to you. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Homosexuality was not uncommon in Greco-Roman culture. How do we know this? Well, in part, you guessed it, because Plato tells us, here writing in Laws, Book 1. One certainly should not fail to observe that when male unites with female for procreation, the pleasure experience is held to be due to nature. But when male with males or female with females, it is held to be contrary to nature, and that those first guilty of such daring behaviour were compelled by their slavery to pleasure. Now, Paul's purpose here in writing is not to single out homosexual practice as more pernicious or a more grievous sin than any other. Indeed, in verses 28 to 32, Paul lists many examples of immoral behaviour, from greed to disobedience to parents to gossip, pride, and many others. But it seems that homosexual practice specifically was prominent in that particular cultural context, which is why Paul speaks to it so specifically here in Romans 1. But whilst the context is specific, the teaching here is universally applicable. The teaching of the Bible, Christian ethics, have not changed on the topic of human sexuality. I trust that the teaching of this church will always be spoken gently and respectfully, but also with clarity and candour. We hold that God has made us male or female, and that these are not interchangeable. That the only proper context for sexual union is marriage, and Christians understand marriage to be a lifelong and exclusive union between one man and one woman. This is the right ordering of relationships. This is orthodox teaching. Let me say also, I can imagine someone saying, for example, because I'm gay, I'm not welcome in Emmanuel Church. Or, as a gay person, I'm open to following Jesus, but don't expect me to change. Let me gently push back on those. Every person is welcome in our church. Every person. It's also true that every person needs forgiveness, both me and you. So you, whoever you are, whether you've been here a long time or are visiting for the first time, you are no more or less deserving of grace than any other person here. And thirdly, as the Spirit shapes our lives, every person here will find that they are changing. That might apply to sexual practices, or to speech, or to personal spending, or to any one of a million different things. But every person who draws near to God in good faith is being changed more and more in the likeness of Christ. I started by speaking of an orchestra. Let me close there also, because these confronting passages fundamentally come down to the question of who gets to choose the direction of your life, and who do you trust to make good choices about how to live. Our society, it appears to me, seems to think that every person can live however they please, without any external authority, without instruction, without, as it were, a divine conductor. Well, the article I quoted at the beginning of the sermon went on to commend why a good conductor is good news for all. Nicholas Collin writes, "The conductor has come to a rehearsal with a cast-iron sense of the outer architecture of a piece of music, to create a very safe but fertile space so that every musician in that room can bring something of what is theirs to the music. An orchestra is the ultimate team. It has the discipline of an army, but it has so much more freedom than that. If the conductor is doing their job properly, they're creating that world where it's safe, but free, so everyone can be themselves in that context. That's what the conductor does, and it is a magical job. Everyone doing whatever they want, that is no freedom at all. It's what Plato calls slavery to pleasure. But ironically, beautifully, to accept God's authority, his instruction, his description and prescription of what a righteous and good life looks like, to be content to play the part that God has given you to play, is to find a world where you are safe but free. And a community like ours, where we are doing our best, individually and collectively, to listen and to play as directed, is not perfect. We are more akin to a Year 7 lunchtime strings group than we are the Sydney Philharmonic Orchestra. But I hope that you can see what we're trying to do, the piece that we are trying to play as we follow the conductor. And I hope that you can see, though flawed in its own way, it is beautiful. And I wish to assure you that there is a place for you here, if you are willing to follow the lead of our conductor. Let me close by saying this. Simon Sinek said, "Difficult conversations are hard, but worthwhile having." Why? Because avoidance doesn't solve the problem, does it? It just slowly breaks down trust and erodes relationships. But the opposite is also true. Having hard conversations is by definition hard. Sometimes allowing someone or giving someone over to experience hard things so that they can learn by those experiences is not easy. But such hard conversations and such hard experiences can be the very catalyst for openness, for vulnerability, and for change. The father in the story of the prodigal son gives his son over to his own desires. I'm sure it was heartbreaking for the father to watch his son go. But he kept hope. Day by day, he watched the horizon, longing for his son to return, and he did. God in Romans 1, by his Spirit, he pulls no punches. We are all idolaters. And whether we are same-sex attracted or not, we all, in our own way, do what verse 28 says, what ought not to be done. And God is calling us out on it. But don't be deceived. God is also calling us home. This is a sermon for next week, but in the words of Romans 2:14, don't you know that God's kindness is intended to lead you, to lead us to repentance?